Good afternoon. Today I'm going to analyze Apologia Pro Poemate Meo, a poem from Wilfred Owen. First of all, the title means In Defense of My Poetry. This poem deals with the atrocities of World War I, in which a soldier describes how the war leads to the disinterest of life and forgets about the feelings while looking for a reason to stay alive. The poem, although it's the response of Owen to a man who asked for more positive poems, it is a critique to the scam that participating in the war is an honorable cause. The speaker in this poem is a soldier, and the listeners are the people who are at home and think that the war is a honorable cause. The mood is of despair, but the tone during the whole poem is sarcastic and is the way in which Owen tries to express his purpose. The structure of the poem is of 9 stanzas, each one of 4 verses. Uh, to discuss, first, I'm going to talk about the irony, then the imagery, and finally about the sensory images in the poem. Okay, so first of all, the irony. In verses 5 and 6, which are merry it was to laughter, where death becomes absurd and life absurder. This irony represents the unhappiness of being at the war, in which soldiers like miss the sense of life. They don't care anymore for life, and this is why death for the speaker is not seen as something terrible but satisfying, which can take soldiers, which can take them out of their daily life, because living in war is already ridiculous. It has no sense. And there is also an irony in the verses 25 and 26, which say, I have perceived much beauty in the harsh odds that kept our courage straight. So, in these verses, the irony it is shown by contrasting the words beauty in verse 25 and kept our courage in verse 25 against or with the horse odds in verse 26. So this contrasting represents like a poor hope in relation with the team that is to deal with life and trying to go ahead, although they apparently have no reason to continue living. So the poor hope is shown in the horse odds, because it is when you relate these words with the courage straight, like the soldiers are trying to keep going, but the hope is so poor, so small, so there is no really something that uh, helps them to continue. Then it is the imagery. We can find imagery in verse 1, where it says, I too saw God through mud. Well, first of all, this imagery is shown in the verse beginning with the I too, because these words include the reader in the experience of the speaker. So it helps the reader to imagine what the speaker is trying to show. So it generates a visual image relating the words God and mud, which are represented, which represent like a disturbed image of the divine that leaves the soldiers suffer for a glory in the war, which is not uh, and which is not something like good. Uh, it is not necessary for soldiers. It is not. It doesn't bring like for them something necessary for their lives and only cause suffering. In this verse, there is also an irony represented in seeing God in the dirt, which can be interpreted as the feeling of yearning for salvation. In verse 14, faces that used to curse me, skull for skull, it is represented the images of the angry faces of the enemy soldiers, which mm, they which Owen and the other soldiers are supposed to hate because they are enemies, but they actually feel empathy because they are going through the same situation, and they are basically forced to fight for something which they can't really feel. Mm, Finally, there are the sensory images. The first one we can find it in the second verse, which is the mud that cracked on cheeks when wretches smiled. And this verse shows a sensory image when we relate the words cracked, cheeks, and wretches because they make the reader feel like the despair and the misery of their lives in that moment, which is represented by the mud cracking on their cheeks. So there is also an irony in this verse between the words smile and mud because this like contrasts the action of happiness, which is smiling, um, and the mud, which is the representation of the difficult challenges of war. There is also a sensory image in verses 19 and 20. For love is not the binding of our lips with the soft silk of eyes that look and love. There is an image um, in the words binding of lips and soft silk of eyes because the reader can feel the touch of binding and the soft silk. And this is a representation of the attempt of finding a reason to stay alive, to keep fighting, and go back home eventually with maybe a person they love. Uh, that's why it says, for love it is not binding of our lips. Mm, To conclude, well, through these three aspects in relation with the wish of finding a reason to stay alive, and the speaker allows the reader to relate and to understand the situation he is living during the war by criticizing those people at home who believe it doesn't matter the suffering because the honorable cause, which is the war, deserved it. But it is not like that.